This video is sponsored by Keeps. More on them later. Hey, do you know what sucks the big one? YouTube age restricting the last worst to best video I made on Metal Gear for a reason that no one seems to want to tell me. Nothing quite like pouring a week of your life into making a video that is now a lot harder for people to watch. So, let's do it again? God of War is significantly more M-rated than Metal Gear, so I'll have to be careful what I show, but in just 17 years, this franchise has cranked out some truly wonderful video games that really drill down on what makes these kind of over-the-top stylized combat games work so well. You're an angry bald man with two sharp swords who really fancies beating up everything that even loosely relates to Greek and more recently Norse mythology, and even though the games don't get too much more complicated than that, it is an addictive setup that they've got here. So with God of War Ragnarok coming out in literally a couple of days after this video goes up, I think it's a good time to go back through the 9 God of War games that currently exist and see how they stack up. And seeing Kratos' shiny head running around in most of them is usually a comforting sight, but personally I'd rather keep my hair and not end up looking like that, in which case I'm very lucky that this video is sponsored by those clever folks over at Keeps. 2 out of 3 guys will experience some form of male pattern baldness before they turn 35, and so we have to be thankful that Keeps are doing so much good work in this field. These guys are very clever when it comes to preventing hair loss with their FDA-approved treatment that comes with years of experience and loads of successful cases under their belts. In fact, these guys are so clever that they know that hair loss is different from one guy to the next, which is why their treatment comes in 3 different variants depending on what kind of hair loss you're experiencing. Plus, you can get everything shipped directly to your door so you don't have to wait for the world to not be terrible before you can fix your hair. Keeps' treatment packages are already cheaper than their competitors, but with the deal they're running with me here today, you can save even more money. For a limited time off, you can go to keeps.com/rabbit or click the link in the description to receive 50% off your first order. Stop hair loss now before it's too late. Anyway, angry Greek man and his video games! Not since I talked about Kirby games have I had such a hard time choosing a worst game in a franchise, because Santa Monica haven't been responsible for a genuinely terrible game during their tenure. The worst I could find was God of War Betrayal, which may sound like it's deserving of that title, especially since it's a mobile game and we all know how those turn out, but actually it's a game from 2007 whose primary fault is that you can't play it anymore. At least not easily, considering it's a Java game designed for phones, and that's just very complicated. Given that it's a mobile game, you can expect it to be not quite as elaborate as console God of Wars, but I gotta say, I don't hate the shift to 2D side-scrolling, and I feel like it complements Betrayal really nicely. Obviously the combat has a fraction of the refinement behind it that the mainline games do, and the decision to work in puzzle mechanics was a nice idea, but one that ultimately never gets too far off the ground. But if you were looking for some God of War in 2007 that you could take on the go with you, this is not bad in the slightest. You gotta know that the equivalent these days would be full of microtransactions, so maybe we're lucky we got this when we did? On the subject of God of War games that are completely different from the usual gameplay style, I think you'd struggle to come up with a game that is further divorced from standard God of War than A Call from the Wilds. I forgot about this game for a while, but before the 2018 reboot came out, we were teased with a text-based adventure game that runs off Facebook that details Atreus' first adventure with several chapters of interactable storytelling. Obviously it's bare bones as hell, but this is what games used to be like back in the day, and it's refreshing seeing a big franchise pay homage to a simpler time, while also tying it into an upcoming release at the time, and also it fleshes out Atreus' backstory a bit and gives you a bit of control over how you want it to all play out. It's a short game with some concept art being a reward should you reach the end, so it's clearly intended as a way of advertising the reboot without being too brazen about it, but it also fleshes out the lore and lets God of War fans experience some text-based adventures for a change. I see no problems with this. Prequels often have a hard time justifying their existence, and from a strictly story point of view, I struggle to get on board with God of War Ascension. At the end of a big trilogy, it makes sense that Santa Monica would want to continue making these games in some capacity, and a prequel is a lot easier to manage instead of some drastic reboot. Ascension was released just 3 years after God of War 3, so there's a fairly transparent through line of how the gameplay pans out, but Ascension was ballsy enough to work in some online multiplayer for both head-to-head and co-op play, which is a little bit weird for God of War, but it works quite well, and it does help this game stand out among a sea of strictly single-player adventures. I don't vibe too well with the story because I feel like it has very little add to the God of War mythos, but as a stopgap until something more major for this franchise, it is not bad at all. It's effectively God of War 0.5, but with the gameplay refinements of God of War 3 and online multiplayer. This is a pretty satisfying mix, all things considered. Hey, did you know that the people behind the Order 1886 had a hand in creating a God of War game? Oh yeah, absolutely, but rather than cranking the graphics up in a hope that people would prefer to watch it rather than play it, Chains of Olympus took to the PSP as this franchise's second attempt at on-the-go gaming, and did a pretty damn good job translating everything that makes a God of War game great onto less powerful hardware. It doesn't shy away from the usual presentation either, and even though the story is very forgettable and not even all that important for the overall plot of the franchise, the moment-to-moment gameplay is very close to matching the best that this series can offer. I've got mad respect for Ready at Dawn's ability to make this work on a handheld without compromising too much, and it's probably one of the best looking games ever made for the PSP. It's a good job all round. If Chains of Olympus was a pretty good PSP equivalent of standard God of War, Ghost of Sparta is just a slightly better example of roughly the same thing. Seriously, looking back over it now, the only major downside to this game is that it's a little short when compared to console God of Wars, and doesn't quite have the same relationship with bombastic set pieces, but as a diet option it has had some nice improvements thrown into the mix. The story's a lot better now, and the revelations that come up in Ghost of Sparta go a long way towards fleshing Kratos out as a character, so clearly Ready at Dawn were coming into their own with this concept, and actually, this increased focus on the narrative helps make Ghost of Sparta more of a required experience than it would be otherwise. So you basically got God of War Light that doesn't skimp on the graphics or the story, and doesn't require quite the same time investment, which all in all makes it basically the best place to start with this franchise if you're not sure if you want to commit to an entire trilogy of games. That's never not gonna be a good thing. Back in 2005, the original God of War was launched through a desire to match the action of something like Devil May Cry with the puzzle solving of a game like Eco, which does sound like an impossible task, but I gotta say, the first God of War is such a good time. A little hard to judge all these years later because I don't want to say it's aged poorly, but I think sequels after this made so many changes and improvements that it can be a little uncomfortable going back to God of War 1. However, this was my first experience of the franchise, and given that this game opens with a Hydra attacking your boat and Kratos dunking on the big snake like a champion, it does set a tone that the game is more than happy to stick to. The Blades of Chaos are just such a fun weapon to use, and even with this being the first game in the franchise, Santa Monica got the most out of using this weapon for some very creative combat and some platforming that occasionally doesn't give me a migraine. Even revisiting this game now, it's pleasantly surprising how many massive highlights are in God of War 1, and it's a glowing endorsement of Santa Monica's ability to hit the ground running with an idea, something they'd reinforced time and time again. Finishing a trilogy of critically acclaimed games isn't easy in the slightest, and you can tell that everyone working on God of War 3 were acutely aware that they needed to raise the bar with this one. Personally, I think it falls a little short of God of War 2, but that's nothing to be ashamed of. And actually, what that game does almost perfectly from a gameplay standpoint, God of War 3 is able to match with its story. I love how this game is able to up the ante seemingly effortlessly and goes from tackling Poseidon off a mountain to fighting a mountain in one of the most ridiculously scaled fights I've ever seen. Sometimes it can read like a checklist of which characters from Greek mythology Kratos hasn't killed yet, but given that this includes heavy hitters like Hades and Helios and, oh yeah, Big Daddy Zeus, it's not a game that slows down very often. I gotta say though that not all of it lands with me, and the awkward platforming boss fight with Hermes is a good example of that, but at the same time the brutality of God of War 3 cannot be underestimated. Not that I can show you any of it because I want to be able to buy food next month. Watch it not even matter in the end. The gap between God of War 2 and 3 is very small in my eyes, and I think it mostly comes down to a battle between the intense gameplay refinement of 2 and the increased sense of spectacle of 3. I think what sways me towards God of War 2 being the best game of the trilogy are the improvements that were made from the first game, and how much of a rush the sequel is in to show off the new stuff. It throws you into the opening boss fight against Colossal of Rhodes and keeps up the pace so well that you never feel like the game is hitting a bump in the road or something. Even the quieter puzzle solving moments are now way more rewarding than they ever were in the first game, and it feels like God of War really found its groove with this game, right down to the graphics being polished just that little bit more so that the hyperviolence isn't diminished. Also, massive points for God of War 2 having time travel in it without being too complicated, and also using it perfectly to show how even predetermined fate doesn't stop Kratos when he's angry enough. It's just good to have that confirmed, you know? The Kratos in God of War 2018 has one of the best beards I've ever seen. But wait, there's more! I was perhaps justifiably concerned about the God of War reboot, since for as brutal as traditional God of War was, it was hardly brainless. It was designed with certain attributes in mind, and swapping out a fixed camera for an over-the-shoulder, typically third-person action game perspective was genuinely a little worrying in the build-up to this. God of War isn't your standard action game, and would the reboot change this as a detriment? Nah, man, you have no idea what you're talking about, because God of War 2018 is some of the best rebooting you're ever likely to see from this industry, because holy fuck does it stick the landing with this change of perspective that extends beyond the camera and manages to include the combat and the puzzle solving, and the characters who are familiar and yet just that slight shade of different, and now we're in Norse mythology and the shift feels so seamless. It's amazing how much more artful this game feels than other God of War games, and yet it never gives up on the sheer brutality of the franchise that it comes from, delivering moment after moment where you can see Kratos come into his own with his new axe, and he even finds some creative uses for that shield. The effort behind this game is astonishing, and it comes through so often and so gloriously that I can't help but love it and be so excited for Ragnarok. This is the bar to clear, and I don't think it could be much higher. Anywho, that was me ranking every God of War game from worst to best. Do you agree? Have you got a different game on top? Let me know in a comment down below. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like and subscribe for more in the future, and hit that bell for notifications of future videos. And if you need something to watch right now, I made this video last week about the scariest Pokemon ever. I also want to thank my top supporters on Patreon, including Scott Riker, Sarah Malion, and the Green Scorpion. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.